Okay, so here we are, episode 3. This is probably the single most important episode. Not that they're not all important. I mean, the Matrix has many aspects to it, many tendrils reaching into our lives, but all of them rely on a steady supply of money. And so if you're the person making the money, obviously this gives you a massive advantage in a money-based system. Now, I'm not going to attempt to go into all of the ins and outs of how our monetary system works. This has already been done far better than I could do it, actual production values. So I would strongly suggest watching one or more of the following. Zeitgeist, the addendum, the first half an hour of that is all about the monetary system. I've already mentioned Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money. That's an excellent 7-part thing. If you watch the first 3 or 4, something like that, that should give you a pretty good understanding. I saw another documentary recently called 97% Owned, which was made by the people at Positive Money, which is another website well worth checking out. So yeah, as I say, I'm not going to go into all of those details. What I am going to begin with is an account of how commercial bank money is created, because that is about 97% of our money supply, hence the title of that documentary, 97% Owned. And I want to look at what the social consequences are of this debt-based, interest accumulating model that we have for generating and circulating money. It's kind of emerged now into the sort of general public awareness that money is created out of nothing. And this is true, but I'm not sure that most people fully grasp the idea or the process, let alone the implications, the ramifications of it. I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit pompous and arrogant, whatever, but for me, if people really did understand it, they'd be a lot angrier about it than they seem to be. The banks literally use money to steal our lives from us. They load us up with debt, and then they make us spend the rest of our lives giving real labour, real time, real sweat in order to pay off this fictitious debt that was created out of thin air. The money they lend us is indeed created out of thin air, and they're only able to make us do that through the coercive reinforcement, the coercive enforcement of laws and governments. It's a proper scam, so let's take a look at how it works.
At last.
Right at the heart of our monetary system lies a very clever little piece of trickery where there is nothing, there is no money. You go into a bank, you fill in a loan agreement, or you borrow some money on a credit card, or whatever. The process is the same, whoever the lender is, and you hand that over to the bank, and they turn that loan agreement into a form of promissory note which will be accepted by other people. So you hand a promissory note over to the bank, in other words, the loan agreement, your promise to repay this loan, and they type some numbers into a data bank, and that amount of money appears in your bank account. And because that's in your bank account, you can now spend that. But they are IOUs. You've filled an agreement to the bank, and they have provided you with those very same IOUs in a form which can now be exchanged for goods and services. On this diagram here, time goes from left to right. So on the left hand side there is no money, there is nothing. And then as you move along from left to right, you reach a point where you have a red line and a blue line which diverge from each other. At that point there, at that point in time, that is the moment at which you have taken out your loan. And so two things are created at that point, and they are opposites of each other. So a debt is created, you owe money to the bank, and the bank creates a bank balance in your favour which you can now go and spend, what we call money. Now from that moment on, as you can see, the red line and the blue line go the same distance away from the central point. You move along further in time, and then they come together again, at which point the loan is paid off, and the money and the debt destroy one another. So they came from nothing, and then when the debt is paid off, the money that pays off that debt is destroyed. There's one crucial thing wrong with this diagram. When the loan is paid off, the amount of money and the amount of debt are exactly equal to each other, and so the money and the debt annihilate one another. However, in the real world, of course, debts come with interest. For example, I've just done a little calculation. If you borrow £100,000 over 25 years at an interest rate of 5%, you end up paying back just shy of £175,000. Now, it's really crucial that you understand this point. Very few people do. That money that the bank gave you in the first place was yours. It was always yours. When you sign that loan agreement, you are giving a promissory note to the bank, and they are taking that promissory note and giving you a bunch of their own IOUs. But they're your IOUs. It's you that's promising to pay that money back. And so all they've done is turn that promissory note into a bunch of numbers in a data bank, or if you're lucky, you get some bits of paper in your hand. And you can exchange those bits of paper or those numbers in a data bank for goods and services, but they are your IOUs. It is your money. It always was. And yet, somehow or other, they feel justified in charging you £75,000 rent on those numbers in a data bank over a period of 25 years. The next important thing to be clear about is that because the bank doesn't own the money that it's lending to people as property in the first place, technically every single loan agreement is not a legal contract, does not form a legal contract, because for a contract to be legal there has to be an exchange of property, what's called a consideration, an exchange of property between the two parties. If the loan is secured, then the bank gets to take whatever property the loan is secured against. So this is a proper illegal contract. Mortgages, in particular, are an excellent example of illegal contracts, because you are putting up the property and the bank is putting up absolutely nothing at all. In the second Zeitgeist movie, they relate the story of a chap called Jerome Daly, who contested the repossession of his house with his local bank in Scott County, Minnesota, 1962, I think it was. And the judge found exactly that there was no legal exchange of property. The bank did not own the money as property. It generated it by bookkeeping entry, and therefore Mr. Daly was allowed to keep his house. Now, interestingly, that court decision was overturned the very next day. There were no appeals, no hearings, no waiting for a court date. It was simply quashed the very next day, because in that court decision lay the end of the monetary system, and of course that could not be allowed to happen. Rich people are getting much too rich from it, so that could not be allowed to happen. But nevertheless, the argument is valid. The banks do not own the money as property, and so technically every single loan contract is a fraudulent document.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole? You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth.
And the third and most important thing to get your head around is this, that going back to my example of the mortgage, my £100,000 mortgage that I did before, the only money which is created by the bank is the £100,000 which they lend me. The £75,000 which I have to pay them in additional interest, they do not create. And so an eternal and ever-growing shortfall in the money supply is created by the application of interest. The amount of debt outstanding is always greater than the amount of money available in circulation to pay it. This creates scarcity in the money supply, and this, for me, is the primary reason why we see greedy, selfish, ultimately rooted in fearful behaviour, because people are worried they're not going to be able to pull enough money out of the ever-dwindling money supply in order to cover their payments on their lives, be it debts, be it bills, be it whatever. And so, like I've said in previous videos, this sets us in competition against each other, both on an individual level and on a company level and even on a national level. I'm going to play another little clip from one of Mike Maloney's videos the fourth one, which is, if you're going to only watch one of them, that's the one to watch. It outlined, I think he calls it the greatest scam of all time, and he explains very clearly exactly how the monetary system robs us. I'm just going to play one little clip from it, just to show the idea visually of unpayable debt building up.
There is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop. If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments. Politicians and pundits alike talk about balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and living within our means. They don't understand that that is deflationary. It is impossible to do under our current monetary system without collapsing the whole economy.
In the US right now, they're talking about raising the debt ceiling again. They do this every year, and it makes me laugh because increasing debt, as I think I've shown pretty clearly, is inevitable under this monetary system. You know, with interest being applied to the debt and not the money to pay the interest, you know, the debt growing faster than money is absolutely inevitable. And so in order to reduce debt, you have to destroy money. If you destroy money, you bring on recession and deflation. And so, you know, it's an impossibility for nations, for individuals, ultimately to get out of debt. At some point, this is going to lead to complete collapse of the financial system, unless, of course, we find the wisdom to change it to something else before it does so. On the screen now is a graph which shows the difference over the last 50 years between the money supply and the debt, and you can see that there's an exponential divergence of money supply and debt, and so collapse is not very far away. I don't see how this can go on for much longer. So, to summarise, two main areas. Firstly, the money that banks lend you is not theirs. Technically, first of all, it's yours, not theirs. It's your promissory note. It's your IOUs that you're spreading around. They're just stamped with, you know, the Bank of England's name. They create it out of nothing at the time that the loan agreement is signed. It is not their property, and so all loans secured against property are a form of illegitimate consideration and are thus void. And thirdly, and most importantly for me, it's a kind of slavery, because they are lending you this fictitious money, and then they are expecting you to pay that back with money which you are going to acquire through real work, sweat, time, giving up time with your family, giving up time doing your leisure activities, etc. The second main area is the concept of the inevitable creation of perpetual, ever-growing, unpayable debt in the economy. Interest payments are forever increasing, faster than the money supply available to pay them. This creates increasingly fierce competition among the population in order to acquire the units. to keep up with their own monthly payments, and ultimately the system must collapse under the weight of its own debt.
No. I don't believe it. It's not possible.
Now, at this point, you may very well be asking yourself, if this monetary system is so obviously flawed and doomed to self-destruction, then why do we have it? Why is there no talk about this on the news, on Horizon, on Panorama? Why are we not being informed of it? Surely, you must be thinking, this can't be right. Well, it is right. There's absolutely tons and tons and tons about this on the internet, and as far as I can tell, little or nothing in the way of anyone saying that this is not how it is. Remember, we are in the matrix, right? And money owns media, money owns government, and these organisations conspire with each other deliberately to keep us in the dark.
I didn't say it would be easy, Neo. I just said it would be the truth.
And this is only level 1. In level 2, we're going to look at how the money supply is expanded, and how that expanded money supply is then in turn used to enslave not just people, but nations and governments, and ultimately the whole world in unpayable debt. Okay, so when you go into the bank and you borrow money, that debt that you incur with the bank now, believe it or not, becomes an asset of the bank because you have promised to pay them this back. This becomes an asset of the bank. And they can buy and sell this asset. This is what securities are. Mortgage-backed securities are mortgages which there is a promise to repay, and so that £100,000 mortgage that we were looking at before is worth in the long term £175,000, but banks may choose to sell that right now for say 130, bank the £30,000 profit, and then pass on the liability and the collection of the monthly payments to a buyer. Now, the importance of these securities I'll talk about in a future video when I look at crashes, but for right now let's look at how the money supply is expanded. So you walk into the bank and you borrow $1,000. And you use that $1,000 to buy, say, a sofa off of eBay. The person you buy that sofa from then deposits that $1,000 into their bank account, and this is where this diagram begins. So, right at the top left-hand corner, a person goes into the bank, deposits their $1,000. The bank is required to keep a reserve. For this example, it's 10%. It's not always 10%, it can be lower than that, and I'll talk about the implications of that in a minute. So, that £1,000 that they have deposited with them, they're required to keep a $100 deposit. Sorry, I said pounds, I meant dollars. They're required to keep a $100 deposit, and they can lend out another $900, but they don't lend out the other $900 that was given to them in the $1,000. That still belongs to the person that deposited it. What they do is they create $900 of new IOUs, and they lend it out to somebody else. So that's the person on the right hand side there. They've gone and borrowed $900. We then go down to the second line. They deposit that $900 into their bank, or they spend it, and somebody else deposits into their bank. Once again, the bank is required to keep a $90 reserve and can create another $810. So at the end of step 1, the bank's created a new $900, so there's the $1,000 we started with plus another $900 they've created. There's now $1,900 in the system, but the bank only has $100 of reserves. At the end of step 2, once the process is repeated again, there's now $2,700 and $1,900 from before, plus a new $810, so $2,710, and the bank has held an additional $90 of reserves, and so the banks now have $190 of reserves, and so on and so on and so on. This diagram here goes up to step 3. In theory, with a 10% reserve, I mean, in theory it can go on forever, but in practice, with a 10% reserve, usually is about a tenfold increase in the money supply. So $1,000 will eventually become $10,000. 10% is a pretty high reserve requirement. Actually, reserve requirements can be as low as 2-3%, sometimes even nothing at all. With a 3% reserve requirement, a $1,000 initial deposit could become as much as $30,000 by the end of it. And remember, they're creating all of this stuff out of thin air at no cost to themselves and lending it all out at interest, so profiting from it, and so they are strongly incentivized to create and lend out as much money as possible. And, you know, with this system, banks can, between them, by lending money to each other and passing it round in a circle, the loan of one to another becomes the reserves of the next one, who can then lend out more, and so on and so on and so on. So essentially, banks can create as much money as they want to. And this is where it gets really kooky, because by being able to create huge volumes of money, commercial banks are now in a position to lend money to governments at interest in exchange for government bonds. I draw your attention to the fact that the word bond is the root word of bondage, and I don't mean bondage as in the whips and chains, not the fun kind of bondage, I mean the slavery kind of bondage. By purchasing government bonds, governments are promising to repay that money to the commercial banks with interest. How do they collect that money at interest? By taxing their citizens. And so society as a whole is being drained by the fact that commercial banks can create as much money as they want out of thin air, lend it back to governments at interest, and so governments now become liable to repay at interest their own currency, for which they are the sole issuing authority. I mean, the whole thing is completely insane. But then, this is the Matrix, right? So we would expect nothing less. So, in short, by controlling the money, banks create debt which they know full well can never be repaid, but equally they know that by all of us, individuals, communities, businesses, even governments and nations, all running around scrabbling desperately to try and keep up with our repayments, that they make us their slaves in the process. And that is what the monetary system is truly all about.
There are fields, endless fields, where human beings are no longer born. We are grown.
And what's personally most galling of all to me is that this has been known about for long periods of time. The dangers of allowing private, powerful banking cartels to control the currency supply are well documented and well known. So if we knew about this 200 years ago, why did we allow it? Well, that's going to be a story for the next video. I don't want these to run over half an hour, so I think that's probably enough for now. Next video is going to start with the meeting on Jekyll Island, where a group of bankers, financiers got together and hammered out the legislation they wanted for the Federal Reserve, and how that was crowbarred through Congress. And then how the Federal Reserve has been used to orchestrate globalization and the building of the biggest empire the world has ever seen, the American Empire. What? American Empire? Yeah, I know. Yes, the American Empire. So yes, that's for the next video. To finish with on this one, we're going to have a little bit more comedy this time. The late, great George Carlin, my personal favourite. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.
There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. They don't want that. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back, so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later, because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club. And by the way, it's the same big club they used to beat you over the head with all day long, when they tell you what to believe. All day long, beating you over the head in their media, telling you what to believe, what to think, and what to buy. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. And nobody seems to notice. Nobody seems to care. Good, honest, hard-working people, white collar, blue collar, doesn't matter what color shirt you have on. Good, honest, hard-working people continue. These are people of modest means. Continue to elect these rich cocksuckers who don't give a fuck about them. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care about you at all. At all. At all. Yeah. You know? And nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. That's what the owners count on, the fact that Americans will probably remain willfully ignorant of the big red, white, and blue dick that's being jammed up their assholes every day. Because the owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.